It's incredible to see so many of you here tonight. Thank you so much for coming out to the final screening of the Cinema Politica 2018-2019 year and our epic 15-year anniversary year. So thank you so much for being here. We begin the event, as always, by acknowledging that we're gathered on the unceded lands of the Ganingehaga Nation, and to remind you that we not only believe that we believe that it's not enough to only acknowledge the land, but that we really, really, truly urge everyone that comes to our screenings to become involved in anti-colonial and indigenous-led struggles and resistance. We are super thrilled to be closing the year with this film, The Worlds of Ursula K. Le Guin, a celebration of her work, life, and radical creative powers that I'm sure all of you here have experienced one way or another, and has inspired a lot of your activist work and vision of the world that you want to live in. So thank you once again for being here. It's our last screening of the semester, and there's so many people that dedicated numerous hours, volunteer hours, and hours of hard work to make this series possible, that I hope you bear with me, but I'm gonna go through and read everyone's names so that we can acknowledge their contribution. First and foremost, we'd like to thank our volunteers: Abdullah Al-Houthi, Angela Kaba, Andres Solis, Erin Heim, Elise Weber, Elizabeth Skeen, Eti, Erika Kulpina, Esther Morant, Hiro Rodrigo, Lauren Delort, Lawrence Wells, Luke Gillis, Lou Nevon, Maggie McCutcheon, Mary Alize, Maya Goethel, Michaela Roberts, Nathan Walsh, Noah Abekasis, Patricia Cornish, Pim Pettibon, Sarah Amar, Sol Carrera, Sophie Eifet Tinger, Shiva Shamlu, Sophie Fagan, and Sura Rogers. They're our amazing volunteers. So big round of applause to everyone. Our tireless team at Concordia: Kaya Singh, Elea Regenbal, Aurelia Talvela, Camille Horox, Denise Sophie, Kushper Dixon. Our director of programming, Ezra Winton, associate programmers, Mohamed El Kari, Viviane Saglier. We're not alone in doing this. The few of us that you see on and off on stage are really not the people that run this sort of big machine of love and sweat and tears and more love. Many of us are barely getting paid. There is, of course, our programming team. We have a big pre-selection team of about 15 people, our board and community advisors, our numerous collaborators. You can see all of them on our website, and co-sponsors, the Montreal Child Care Collective, who've been providing childcare on and off for those of you with kids. We're extremely grateful for their support, as well as all the active listeners from the Center for Gender Advocacy. The cinemas team, the incredible team here at Concordia: Mandy Morgan, Katie Gilkes, our amazing one-of-a-kind projectionist, Jean-Francois Martin. We cannot possibly imagine surviving without you. Thank you so much. As well as our interns, Alan Bleich and Evelyn Auger. And interns, yes, paid and for credit. And thank you so much. And of course, I know many of you were here. I want to mention some of the fantastic guest speakers we had with us this year. Yesterday we had a fabulous event with Ryan McMahon, the creator of the Thunder Bay podcast and the JA DeSef Cinema. We recorded this on video, and there's also an audio of the event. We've recorded many of our Q&As, so we'll be releasing them slowly throughout the summer. And of course, some of our favorite guests: Anand Patwardhan, all the way from India, Astra Taylor, Siva Federici, Winona LeDuc, Gani Ngehata Korn, Robert Greene, Lido Pimienta was on Skype. Come on, that was amazing. And many, many, many more that we were extremely thrilled and happy and privileged to bring here and to have them speak with you. So thank you so much for supporting us and showing up over and over again to our events. Tonight's screening is co-presented with Horizon Imaginaire, and co-sponsored by FASA Concordia. So I just want to call Kate Scheckler to just say a couple of words about Horizon Imaginaire.
Good evening, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to the screening of The Worlds of Ursula K. Le Guin, hosted by Concordia Cinema Politico and Horizon Imaginaire. There is so much to say about Ursula K. Le Guin. I have so much to say about Ursula K. Le Guin. But I only have a few minutes, so we're going to cut to the chase. And the first thing I want to say most about Ursula K. Le Guin is she was an anomaly. She is an anomaly. But she's not an anomaly for the reasons that we usually think she is. She's not an anomaly because she was so good at what she did and a woman in a man's world that she could not be ignored. She is not an anomaly specifically because she was the first woman to win both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards for Best Novel. She's also not an anomaly because she was the first person to win both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards in the same year twice. Okay? The first person, not the first woman, the first person. None of these are the reasons she's an anomaly. They're all a product of the reason that she's an anomaly. And she is an anomaly first and foremost because she approached the other with respect at all times.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to add that the discussion with Sue, Joe, and Helen Chau Bradley will be moderated by our dear James Goddard, who's a fantastic interdisciplinary artist and coordinator also of our documentary futurism project. James. Last but not least, if you feel like you're going to miss us a lot during the summer, don't despair. We are preparing a number of screenings in the parks, special events with different collaborators like Funambul Media et Cinéma sur les Étoiles. We have a few special plans for you. And also, of course, there is Cinema Politica on demand that you could always go to, subscribe, and watch some of our films that we've screened throughout the years on our streaming platform. So I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to let you enjoy the beautiful work and life work of Ursula K. Le Guin. Enjoy.
So in the second seat over from me, we have Sujay Sokol, a social rights advocate, activist, and writer of speculative and interstitial fiction. A former legal services lawyer from New York City, she now makes Montreal her home. Sue's short fiction has appeared in a number of magazines and anthologies. Her debut novel, Cycling to Asylum, was longlisted for the Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic, and has now been optioned for development into a feature-length film. Sue's new novel, Run, Jay, Run, will be coming out with Renaissance Press next month. When she is not battling slumlords, bringing evil bureaucracies to their knees, and smashing borders, Sue curates and participates in readings and literary events across Canada and abroad. Excellent. So maybe a round. So now, at the far end there, we have Joe Walton, who is a Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Award-winning author of 13 novels, 1 short story collection, and 2 nonfiction books about science fiction. She also reads a lot. She comes from Wales and lives in NDG. So a round of applause for Joe. And as you may have picked up in the movie, they mentioned that Ursula won the Hugo and Nebula in the same year, and Joe has also accomplished that feat. And it is a remarkable feat.
There's a for Hugo this year.
Pardon?
She's been nominated, right? Can I say that? Yeah. She's been nominated for a Hugo this year too. Just thought I'd throw that in.
In the best related category.
And right next to me, we have Helen Chau Bradley, a queer mixed-race writer, musician, and arts administrator. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Carte Blanche, Cosmonauts Avenue, and the Montreal Review of Books. She plays in the band Heathers, works for Pop Montreal, and hosts the Strange Futures Book Club at Librairie Drouin Quarterly. Find her reading recommendations at, then another at, but like the symbol at, Notes of a Crocodile on Instagram. So that's the introductions out of the way. I thought I would start off by posing a question to all of you, and it's a bit of an softball to get us started talking about things. Maybe we could start with, what was your first experience with Ursula K. Le Guin? Joe, would you like to start?
My first experience was I got given the Earthsea trilogy as a kid. I believe it was for my 10th birthday. And I read those and I thought that they were really great. And then a couple of years later, I'd read all of the children's books in the library. And I thought that if I read books that were in the adult section that were written by people who'd also written children's books, I could get away with taking them, because if I got caught, I could claim they'd been misshelved with the children's books. Yeah. So the very first thing that I got out of the adult section was The Dispossessed. And I was 12, and it just completely blew my head off. Yeah, that was amazing.
Is this working? Yes, good. I don't remember if the first book I read was The Lathe of Heaven or Always Coming Home. It was one of those two, but Always Coming Home is the one I remember. I had been reading Asimov and Heinlein and all the things you read, and then there was this book, and there were maps and recipes and poetry and music and this beautiful, beautiful description of a world I wanted to live in, and I thought, oh my God, wait, no, and I never went back. Like this, I just want to read these kind of books. So that was my first experience.
Hello. Yeah, I didn't come around to Le Guin until maybe my earlier mid-20s, actually. I think for a long time I thought science fiction wasn't for me. I think I had read like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne as a child. And I was like, oh, it's just about men exploring underwater caves. Which is, fine, but I thought I was done with that. But then a friend lent me The Birthday of the World, which is a collection of a bunch of her like really, really beautiful short stories with a novella at the end called Paradise is Lost. And yeah, I think I was hooked. I was hooked from the first story in that series, and it really like opened up the world of like what science fiction and speculative fiction could be for me.
Great. Let's maybe talk about The Dispossessed a bit. Has everyone read The Dispossessed?
Very recently, I will admit.
Okay.
But yes.
So that book is very interesting, and again, as was mentioned I guess the movie's not really there anymore, but if I gesture there, I'm saying in the movie. It had a dramatic impact on a lot of people's organizing, as well as just creative work. So I was curious if, in reading Le Guin, how do you find that? I found when I read The Dispossessed that it's political without being didactic, and I thought that was like a very beautiful, powerful aspect of her work. And I wondered if any of you had similar experiences, or what you felt was the strongest political aspect of Ursula K. Le Guin's work.
I think that's certainly true of The Dispossessed, that it's political without being didactic. It's got the politics in the right place, and it makes you think about politics, and it makes you think about the real world without it forcing you to do that. It makes you do that because you're thinking from having read it. Rather than, for instance, her much weaker book, the word for world is forest, where I feel the politics isn't quite in the right place, and the analogy with the Vietnam War is too obvious, and that does feel didactic. It feels like I'm being told what to think, rather than showing me something and making me actually think. And I think if you put those two books together, you can see a really good masterclass in how to do it.
I'm so glad you asked about the dispossessed, because I read most of Ursula Le Guin books a long time ago, and I decided to reread one, and that was the one I reread. I just remember, it made me realize what a profound effect that book had on my political thinking, as well as, you know, my literary thinking. It's so real. That's what's so great about that book. You know, they call it, you know, a imperfect utopia, but it's like the people are real, and you could just imagine that this is how it would happen exactly. Yeah. And she points to the flaws, but you also see the beauty in the society, and it's just an amazing book.
Yeah, I oddly didn't read The Dispossessed until a couple weeks ago. But that's good, because it's fresh in my mind, and yeah, I really loved it. I think, yeah, it's like a great example of how she can just plunge you right into the middle of you know, reality, or a series of realities that she's inventing. Like she says, she writes things into being, and I think that's really true. And I guess it also reminds me of how she'll sometimes return to certain worlds when she feels like she hasn't explored them deeply enough. So we have the world of, sorry, I'm sort of seeking into a different book, but the world of the Left Hand of Darkness, which is Gethin, the winter planet with the androgynous human inhabitants. And then one of the stories in the Birthday of the World collection is her like going back to that world, and instead of narrating it from the point of view of an outsider, which is the case in Left Hand of Darkness, she says something in the prologue to it, which is like, I realized that I needed to return to this world and have it like explained to me by somebody who actually is from there. And I liked that she could change perspective in that way. I find that very powerful, like throughout her oeuvre.
Just one more thing on the dispossessed and politics. One of the things that science fiction can do is be a crucible, a thought experiment testing ground for political ideas. And that's something that science fiction has done a lot, and that a lot of people have used science fiction for. And The Dispossessed both does that with, as she was saying, an anarchist utopia. That sounds cool. But it both does that, and it's a really good novel of character. It could be compared with anything that any human has ever written as a novel of character, as well as being a political novel, as well as being a science fiction novel about a guy inventing a scientific thing. Yeah, it's a very traditional science fiction novel in some ways, but it's also doing all this other stuff too. It's just a terrific book.
Even the way it's structured with the alternating chapters between the moon, Anaris, and the...
Urus.
Urus is the moon, and then Anaris is the planet, the capitalist planet that they escape.
No, it's the other way around.
One way, the chapters alternate between one is on the moon and one is on the capitalist planet.
And the novel has a helical structure, so that it begins in the middle and heads towards that point in a really amazing way. You can totally see why it blew my head off when I was 12, and is it my first adult novel?
Interestingly, I had sort of the opposite experience, because when I was 12, I picked up The Word for World as Forest.
Oh, really?
And was completely turned off. I got like 3/4 of the way through, and I was like, ugh.
Yeah.
And I didn't pick it up again until years later, after reading the Earthsea novels and finding my way back to Le Guin. So it was,
Could I just add another little thing? It's just that what she does in that book, and she does this in a lot of her work, is shows you so much detail. Like, it's not just, okay, this is how we do the work shifts, and this is what the meals look like, or whatever, but she delves into the language and the culture and how it would be affected if you lived on this planet instead of this other planet. Like, people don't use possessive language. It's not like, here's my handkerchief. It's like, you know, you could borrow the handkerchief I'm using. It's like you don't possess the things. And then there's a scene in the book where, like, there's sort of, people are sort of mad and they kind of want to riot, but they kind of don't know how, because they're so used to just rules not being bad, that things work in a way that's best for everyone, and we've all decided, so they're kind of at a loss to how do you rebel, you know, and it was really, really interesting how deep she went into it.
and even there's like a small phrase where they're talking about the central character's mother, and
The mother.
the
The mother, right.
the parents are all, characters' parents are always referred to as the mother or the father, not your mother or your father, again, because of this lack of possessive nature. So I feel like this is a good time to jump off and move maybe a little bit away from speaking specifically about Le Guin. The film talks about her having sort of a creative awakening and realizing that she had to reckon more deeply with how gender was represented and power dynamics were represented in her work and in works in general. And I wondered if, as all three of you are creative types in your own right, how do you confront power and privilege in your own creative work? Too big a question?
So, I think there's two parts of that. And one is that as a writer, you're also a human being. And you've got to confront things as a human being before you can as a writer, or as you do as a writer. And the other thing, the answer I usually give to this is that it's like putting salt in ice cream. You don't want salty ice cream. You want the thing that you're writing, the creative work that you're writing, to be the story first. But you know those old ice cream makers, you put salt in the outside of them and it made it get cold? That's where the salt belongs, not in the ice cream, out there powering it, making it get cold. And it's got to be in the right place. And so that's where I think the politics go, and the ways that I'm wrestling as a human being with all of this stuff. They're around the outside of the story, making the inside of the story what it is, but the story is the story. And again, looking at word for word is forest, the salt got in the ice cream. That's the metaphor that I use when I'm thinking about this for myself.
I mean, I enjoy writing things that are both sort of dystopia and utopia, or dark with hope. But I'm not one of those writers who is able to imagine this extremely radical, more perfect, more beautiful world. So I tend to stick pretty closely to what we have and try to, I feel like my job, or the thing that I can do better, is reveal what we have, maybe by exaggerating or showing it in different contexts, and then give a little peek of what would be better, what would be less oppressive, but I'm not one of those really brilliant people who go boom, you know, and that's not even what I really want to do. I want to show how it is and show the next step for making it better.
I'm not a speculative fiction writer, so I'm coming at it from a maybe different place from the two of you, but I don't know, that's a really big question. I guess I try in my writing, or in like writing lyrics for my band and whatnot, to try to be real about where I am situated within like the various power structures that exist, and try to write as honestly and challengingly from that place as I can. And I don't know if I certainly probably don't always succeed at that, but yeah, and I think like with Le Guin, it was sort of interesting to, now I'm pointing at the non-existent movie also, to hear about like her father having been an anthropologist, which I didn't know, and to sort of hear about how maybe, you know, there's some problematic elements to that, of, you know, white colonizers anthropologizing other people. Yeah, and it sort of made me think about how, like, some of her stories, which are still very powerful, are written from this perspective, like, of an anthropologist coming in from the ecumen and observing the, you know, traditions and cultures of a planet that they don't know very much about. And I think that though I appreciate those stories, I prefer the ones where she is actually situating her protagonist like in the world and as part of the world that she's trying to show the rest of us.
Have you read the stories that are collected in 4 Ways to Forgiveness and now 5 Ways to Forgiveness, because she wrote an extra one?
I'm not sure, because I think I've actually read some anthologies of hers that
Right.
maybe take stories from different
you
initial
you probably
collections.
have, because they're actually, it's a late book, and that's actually kind of interrogating that specific thing, because it's sort of, they're about slavery and a planet, and they've got the person from the ecumen with his Ansible so that he can talk to the ecumen, and he's got this position and he's looking at this thing, and then he's drawn more and more into it, and the latest stories are from the people in the world, and he is still there as an external person but from their point of view. And it's really sort of taking this anthropologist comes to planet and observes it idea that she really used a lot in her earlier books, and sort of turning it inside out in this context of writing about slavery on these 2 planets.
4 Ways to Forgiveness?
4 Ways to Forgiveness, and recently it's been reissued as 5 Ways to Forgiveness with the extra story, Old Music and the Slave Woman, which is a...
That one I think I read in another
I
collection.
really like that story, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even in Rockinon's world, her first book, it's a Tarrant. I mean, when they mentioned her early books were like very straight pulp, like literally giant flying tigers on the cover, a dude holding like a flaming thing. But yeah, the premise, it's a Terran scientist goes to Rockinon's world and explores it. So it's.
And I think though that they were a little unfair to Planet of Exile. Because Planet of Exile, there's an awful lot of science fiction that is about colonization, and it's all about the colonization of North America, and indeed specifically the US and the Western frontier. Whereas Planet of Exile is about colonization of Greenland. It's Greenland in space. What happened to the Vikings in Greenland in space. And I think that is a really interesting thing to do with colonization, and it's got it's got a male and a female central character. But I think that they dismissed that a little quickly when they were going over and saying these were pulpy. I love that book.
And I mean, they also are still a lot of fun, and she's a very great lyrical writer. So even when she's writing pulp, the language is very rich and reads beautifully.
Yeah. Yeah, and Rockinon's world kind of calls out to mythology. It sort of uses faster than light to do the fairy tale thing of going into Elfland and coming back and it's 100 years later. Very, very clever. Yeah, Semele's Necklace is the first bit of Rockinon's world.
So I wanted to maybe take this moment. So as we're talking about pulp and genre and where how these things are looked at, I was wondering if, and maybe we can start at this end, and you can speak from your experience a bit as a bookseller, how the marginalization of speculative fiction has changed since Ursula K. Le Guin's time. Obviously, they gesture at it in the movie, but I think we're maybe seeing even more recently, a new re-evaluating of science fiction?
Well, I was a bookseller at the Librairie Drawn and Quarterly for about 5 years, so I might have a bit of a biased sense of this, just because it's a comics store as well as a seller of prose. So I think that a lot of the people who come to D&Q to buy books are already a little perhaps more leaning towards or more open towards pulpier things or more genre types of books because of the graphic novel and comics element. But I guess even maybe over the 5 years I worked there, I felt that there was maybe a growing interest in speculative fiction and taking it seriously as real literature. And personally, I think I got more and more invested in ordering in and selling speculative fiction and science fiction written by racialized people and by QT-POC people, and that's redundant, sorry. Just by people who are not often represented in sci-fi, even sci-fi that's written by straight white women, for example. I guess I became more aware of wanting to push these books on people who came in. I don't know how successful I was. But.
I remember a conversation I had with a friend of mine who used to work in a bookstore. We were talking about this, and she said how she was shelving books, and she put Ursula GUIN book in science fiction, and the manager yelled at her and said, no, that goes in literary fiction. And it was just I was so horrified. You're going to take all of our best authors out of our genre and stick them somewhere else? That doesn't seem, fair, right? I still think it's somewhat of a tension. I'm in a writing group with quote-unquote literary writers, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I write speculative fiction within that world. But I do think more and more, and then when literary writers write something speculative, it's oh my gosh, but it's hey, actually we wrote this story 40 years ago. But anyway, so yeah, I'm happy to see that it's coming together a bit more, because there's a lot of really high quality stuff in speculative fiction.
I think it is getting a lot more attention than it used to. The Globe and Mail reviews science fiction now. The New York Times reviews science fiction. Not just sort of when Margaret Atwood writes it, but regularly. There's a lot more taking it seriously in the mainstream than there was. And also, because there are a lot more marginalized voices being heard in genre, then people who are coming from gender studies and from different areas of marginalized studies are looking at that work in an interesting way and getting that attention, which is great.
And just to add that, one of the things I love many things about Ursula Le Guin, but she never tried to pretend she was anything other than a science fiction and fantasy writer. Yeah. Unlike, Margaret Atwood, I don't think thinks of herself as a. No. And that was an ongoing battle between the two of them, a dispute. And I like that kind of realistic and that loyalty. And the other thing that's cool about speculative fiction is, if you look at who's winning the big awards these days, they are queer people, they are people of color, they are women. In our genre, I can say our genre, whatever. I feel we're starting to do better, and maybe we could be sort of
Yeah. It's steps in the right direction in recent years, certainly.
But not without a notable and vocal backlash.
Right. Yeah.
The sad and rabid puppies.
Yes.
Yeah,
but we defeated them.
We defeated them. They're gone.
Won.
They're not going to be at the Hugos this year.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah. But in Le Guin's National Book Award speech, where most people just say thank you very much, now I'm canon. Yeah. And they were talking about the film. One of the things that she said that they didn't quote is she said that speculative fiction writers are realists of a larger reality. In claiming her identity as a science fiction writer and being recognized as that. Realists of a larger reality, which I think is just a wonderful, wonderful phrase. And I wrote to her after I heard that speech. I emailed her and I said, well, what a great speech, you know, what a wonderful speech. It's just so inspiring. It really makes me sort of want to write. It fills me with desire to write and be inspired. And she wrote back and said, well, get on with it then.
All right. Well, I've just been given a note that we have probably about 15 minutes now, so I'd like to open the floor to any questions that might come from people over there, or right there in the middle.
I think that it certainly helped. The fact that there was this giant phenomenon of reading, that reading was cool, and that they wanted to read, all of them. Just reading was wonderful and means that more people are reading as they carry on. And that what they were reading had wizards and magic and was fantasy meant that, yeah, they're a demographic, they want to read more stuff like that. You could see it instantly. The whole of Diana Wynne Jones' backlist went back into print when I think 3 or 4 Harry Potter books were out, and it was a phenomenon. Suddenly, you could buy these books that before you'd be scouring secondhand bookshops for. You know, suddenly there they all were again on the shelf in Indigo. It's been great. A very small group of writers, all men, all American, all kind of right-wing, started a movement to have a slate to get votes on the Hugo, to get books on the Hugo ballot so that they could win Hugos, because they felt it was unfair. They weren't being given Hugos, and that they were instead being won by people like me. And also by people of color and so on. People
and
that
Lecky,
they felt, right. Yeah, well, no, it was before.
Yeah.
But yeah, they hate N.K. Jemisin. Boy, do they hate N.K. Jemisin. But that's basically, they felt like, or they said they did, that things were being voted for political reasons and not because they were good. And they packed the ballot in 2015 and to a lesser extent in 2016. Because it doesn't actually take very many people to nominate something to get it on the ballot. And we voted no award in the categories they'd done this in, and in categories that still had real nominees, we voted for the real nominee, and we changed the rules to make it harder for them to cheat and get things on. And as of 2017 and 2018 and 2019, it's all fine again. They're kind of petty little idiots. And everybody knows that now. And the people who started it, the two entitled guys who started it, kind of got overwhelmed by what happened and by some real enemies of discourse who came along and jumped on their bandwagon with the rabid movement. And some of them have got ties in really fascist places. And so the people who started it, Torgerson and Carrera, are actually now really embarrassed. It's like, I don't know if they're sorry, but they're really, really, really embarrassed that they did this thing. And it just, you know, it didn't work because the vast majority of people love N.K. Jemisin. And, you know, and N.K. Jemisin is a really good writer. And she won 3 Hugos in a row, 3 Best Novel Hugos in a row, which nobody's ever done before. And she's an African-American writer. in case anybody can't tell that from the initials NK. But yeah, so you know, it just didn't work.
I read the Earthsea books when I was pretty young, and I mean, I like them. You know, I read a lot of things when I was pretty young that if I read them today, I would be rolling my eyes a bit. And I don't know, I remember thinking it was interesting and different and more somehow realistic. But I don't remember it that well, honestly, because I read it a long time ago. But I did feel like it was sort of, you know, a bit of a departure from the other.
Okay, so I read it when it came out, and it came out in 1990, and my son had just been born. And I read Tahanu walking up and down with him in a front carrier on my front, because it was the only way to get him to sleep. And I read it out loud because he needed to be lulled to sleep, which was actually a really interesting way to read that particular book. And I felt that it was an interesting book to be written so long after the others and to be a reimagination in a way. And I thought, you know, they're going to package this so people are going to turn straight from the last page of The Farthest Shore to the first page of this, and that's bad. You need 15 years in between or you're not going to get it. And that was my initial reaction to Tahanu. But I think that there is something wrong with Tahanu, beyond that, whatever. And I think that it is that she's trying to do a thing that's very, very hard to do. So in the first 3 Earthsea books, she's going with the way that story works. So Wizard of Earthsea is a male coming of age and confronting the shadow. Tombs of Atuan very much is the female coming of age and confronting the shadow. Farthest Shore is about death. And these are all very kind of archetypal stories. Whereas Tahanu, she's trying to go uphill. And a lot of the time in Tahanu, I feel that she's saying women's lives are important, normal ways of living are important. But she can't have a plot with that. She's got to have an invasion of evil wizards in order to have a story. Because in a fantasy novel, you kind of have to have an adventure plot, and the adventure plot doesn't go with the rolling the stone uphill thing that she's doing with the story. So I think that the book kind of doesn't work. But it's a very hard thing to do. I've tried to do it myself. And you know, it's hard. Who knew? It's really, really difficult to get away from that thing and make that work. And I'm not sure the other wind works either for me. So it's good that you like that. But I also feel very conflicted about that. So, yeah. I am forever realizing that I put things in and that wouldn't be the way that I would do it now. Not so much on that, which is something that I had thought about a lot, but on racism and homophobia. When I read things that I wrote nearly 20 years ago and I'm embarrassed by them, that's good because it means the world has moved on and I have learned things. And when you're trying to deal with difficult things, that's just sort of likely to happen. So I've had that experience repeatedly in terms of dealing with my own internalized stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent answer. I mean, I haven't been a writer anywhere near as long as Joe, but even in a short time, you know, I'm writing a sequel to my first novel, and there are things I'm definitely, you know, going to do differently now. I think one of the things that was great about Ursula is how she was able to acknowledge that, you know, she could do better, you know, and some of the criticisms were just, and she's going to try. I mean, that's what I liked about Tahanu. She was trying to go back and fix and deepen, and then she did the same thing with, was it the birthday of...
Coming of Age in Carhide.
Yes, she did it with that too. I think it worked better in that case. But I love that she did that, and she kept on.
Yeah.
And it's a great thing about her. But as you said, it's also, I wouldn't have thought of this, but it's a great thing about the world to show that maybe we're making a little bit of progress at least.
I feel that it is. And also her other children's series that hasn't been mentioned at all, the Western Shore books, which she wrote after she revisited Earthsea, which are much more feminist and much more integrated, and the story working much better than in Tahanu. Gifts is the first one. Gifts, something, and powers. Voices, that's right, yeah. That's just exactly the kind of title I always forget. But I think those are great. I think those are as good as the first Earthsea trilogy. I'm not conflicted about those. I think those are wonderful. When I wrote about those, I called the title of the post was A New Island of Stability. I think those are terrific. And she just kept on doing that. And she never got complacent. And she never said, okay, I'm done with that thing. I got it right. She just kept on doing that. And that is an inspiration too.
Yeah, I've always appreciated that about her. Like, I remember listening to various interviews where she would talk about revisiting older works of hers and kind of realizing maybe like what she could have done better, and then working pretty actively to try to do that thing better. I would say for me, to go back to your question, I think that I wrote a lot more when I was a kid and when I was a teenager, and I think I just always thought that I needed to write myself as like white and straight back then, and it wasn't even something that I was particularly aware of. And then I just didn't write for a really, really long time, maybe like a good decade or so, because I don't know, I was very blocked. And I think part of fairly recently actually getting unblocked around that is realizing that I don't want to be writing myself as white because I'm not white. And that sounds very obvious, but I liked to hear her talk about how she was like, oh, whoops, I'm writing myself as a man, or like writing myself like trying to think or trying to write the way a man would, or the way that a man expects that I would. And yeah, I think I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of my own writing and trying to bring my otherness into it, or trying to center that more and help having that make me feel unblocked in a lot of ways.
I guess I'll kind of go with that. I mean, it's interesting because before I started writing, I wrote a fan letter to Ursula Le Guin. It's the only fan letter I ever wrote to a writer. And I said that the thing I loved about her writing that was different, I felt, from a lot of science fiction writers, is that she doesn't just have like a technological or scientific imagination, but she has a social imagination and a political imagination. And she wrote back to me and she said, oh, that's a pretty interesting way of looking at it. You know, I hadn't thought about it in those words, but I really do think that's what this world needs. Now, has this had an impact? Will this have an impact? I mean, we have to wait and see, but I feel like science fiction, speculative fiction, is specially placed to try to combat the injustices of the world, because it's about thinking of different ways, different worlds, different ways of being, different systems, and writers like her who are so talented at doing that. And you have to read The Dispossessed if you haven't, just to see how well she's able to do that. It's just because if you can't imagine another way of living, how can you build that world? If you can't imagine it first, you can't build it. And that's what I think, that's why I think speculative fiction goes so well with social justice movements and social change.
And I think that within science fiction and fantasy writing, there is a strong social justice element. And I think part of that is her legacy. The fact that she was there in the 60s and 70s writing what she was writing meant that as what was being laid down then broadened the spectrum of what could be written later, and what could be built on. And I think that she has a huge legacy. When you look at something like Uncanny Magazine with their Destroy issues, the first one was Women Destroy Science Fiction, and it was all stories by women, okay, relatively tame. And then they did People of Color Destroy Science Fiction, and they did Queer People Destroy Science Fiction, and most recently, Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction. And just the fact that a commercial magazine is doing that stuff and centering those kinds of stories is part of her legacy. I think we wouldn't be in this space. And when Neil Gaiman quoted me in that movie on how the left hand of darkness changed the world, yeah. What I actually said, the other half of that is that we're living in the world the left hand of darkness made, and that's why she wouldn't write it like that now, because the world that we live in has changed because of that book. So the world that we have is not the world that she wrote it in, because we've got it, and she did it. And I think an immense impact and legacy, even when things seem awful. The longer a perspective you actually have in your own memory, the easier it is to be a little optimistic, because of the arc of justice genuinely seeming to bend in a more positive way. Even when there are terrible, terrible things, we're still not in the state we were in the early 80s, which is when I came to political consciousness. So, you know, don't despair in presentism, even though it's awful.
Yeah, I think part of her legacy, as you've both been saying and as you've mentioned, is that, yeah, like, you know, writing can very much function as disruption and dismantling, and I guess I'm also thinking of like the legacy of Octavia Butler, and you know, there was a collection of new speculative fiction by younger writers, many writers of color, queer writers, organizers, called Octavia's Brood, that was co-edited by Adrienne Marie Brown, who we saw in the film, and Walida Imarisha, who's also an anti-prison activist, among other things. And I like that, you know, that collection really introduces us to a lot of younger voices and people who are still trying to, you know, imagine other worlds, other futures, including, you know, a world without prisons, which I think is like a very important thing to be speculating on and imagining into being.
Yeah.
And also, just like as a specific legacy of the Left Hand of Darkness, you have recently Anne Leckie's book, the Imperial Ratch trilogy, and she kind of does the Left Hand of Darkness thing where all characters have one gender, but does it with the she pronoun as opposed to the he pronoun. So it's kind of an interesting.
But not a gender-neutral pronoun.
No, no. Pointedly not, because anyways, it's about a spaceship who obviously wouldn't actually be gendered. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Because the ship is a she, that's where the she comes from.
Yeah.
right. Okay.
So that's the choice of she is based on the history of ships being she.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The choice of she is because the character is a ship and ships are she. I'm just saying that so that you can all hear.
Mm-hmm. I think that's all we have time for, and thank you all for coming. And sign up for our mailing list and stay tuned to hear about Cinema Politica's next season starting in September.